Welcome to RevOps Revolution, where we focus on changing the game for driving revenue. I'm your host, Jesse Morris, and each episode we take a look at the different areas that affect change and drive revenue across your organization. If this is your first time joining us, please subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episode. Here's to the revolution. Welcome to another day of the revolution. I'm your host, Jesse Morris, and today we have one of my former leaders and mentors, Russ, joining us today. Russ, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here.
It's great to be here. It's a real honor to be here and having the opportunity to talk to you.
Awesome. So I'm excited to have Russ on today. Russ is currently a chief growth officer for a SaaS company, and he's been a leader in SaaS, I think, for nearly 20 years. I was looking at your LinkedIn the other day. I didn't realize it was that long, but man, you've got a lot of great experience in the area.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And I think when I look back on it, some of the things I've really enjoyed working with you on, and even just like looking at you for advice as I've grown my own career. And it's one of the things that stuck out to me about your leadership style is the culture, because I think that's one of the things you're really good at, is creating really good cultures while also finding a way to win. And that's such a tough balance, as you know, within your role and everything. So really, again, appreciate you joining us. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So I think I did have an unusual way of getting started with either a CRO or a chief growth officer role, in that I came out of school, I was a data scientist. And what I learned was that in a room full of data scientists, I was usually not the smartest guy in the room. But in a room full of salespeople, I was at least to the right of the bell curve, simply because I knew what a bell curve was. So I thought it was an area where I could make a difference. And I think what's happened over the last 25 plus years is that having some competency and some curiosity about metrics and empirical data and letting it drive the business has become more and more important in leadership roles. So I feel like that background ended up sort of serving me well as I made the switch into sales and growth leadership. And now I joined the company I'm with today in January of 2017, and we globally we sell revenue management software to the hospitality industry, so that hotels can use us to better understand how to price their rooms and manage their inventory. And it's sort of an extension of what I've been doing, as you said, for the last 20 years.
That's awesome. And I think one of the things that stands out to me about your current role today is the international experience. And I think, for me, that's newer. I just started with my current role as well here in the last 7 months. And that's really been my first foray into it. But I think one of the things I love to dig in today is just get a perspective of you. What are some of the things you're doing, in those kind of cross-cultural environments to really foster a great culture and really, lead in an impactful and an influential way?
Yeah, well, I think there have been a few times in my career that I've either had multinational organizations, if it was the Americas, and I had all of Latin America as well as the Americas, where I've had global teams. And I think it's easy to underestimate how different it is to look after a global organization than one that's just based in your own country. Because even if you were to look at the differences between making a sales call, Jesse, in New York versus Alabama, I mean, you can appreciate that culturally, those are likely to be very different sort of organizations that you'd be reaching out to. And that is magnified when you go across the globe. And that's maybe the obvious part about what's different, is having sensitivity to those cultural differences, and not only sensitivity to the cultural differences, but what you'll find is that people in other countries are always sort of arching their back a little bit when an American is coming in and sort of telling them what to do. Or you could pick anyone from any country. I think you have to, whether those differences are as magnified as those individuals with whom you're working believe they are, you have to be sensitive to the fact that the people with whom you're working believe that. And you can't take it for granted that there's maybe more in common with people from country to country than there is that's different. But more than that, there's elements of working across the globe that are different besides just what's happening with the cultural differences. So if you were to drive a change initiative even within your own organization locally, you can sort of see body language from day to day. Are people getting on board with this or not? And when you try to do that, when people's time zones are, leading into different sleep patterns, it's so much easier for them just to say, "Oh, as soon as he gets back on the plane, we're going to go back and do it the way that we wanted to." And I've had some of that over the years. So I think you really need to lean into the change initiatives in a different way. You need to be much more thoughtful and deliberate about what your priorities are. You need to truly get people on board and not just give them a list of tasks and expectations. You need to have them believe that the change is the right thing for them, as well as you just telling it to them. And uh, time and time again, I've seen getting back on the plane and seeing things not working out the way that I'd hoped that they would have taught me this lesson. And there's lots of ways you do that. Part of it is the preparation you bring to the table. You bring the data to the table, make sure that people see the narrative and the supporting evidence that the change is the right thing to do. And don't take it for granted that just because they happen to have a line that reports into you on the org chart, that they're going to kind of follow your direction to the letter of the law. You really need to be as careful in assessing your internal stakeholders as you are your external stakeholders to see if they're really buying into the program.
So it's interesting, one of the things as I took on my new role here, they talk, and I think you hear this is it's a local thing, but I actually don't think it has really anything to do with localization. I just think it's people in general. But they talked a lot about, hey, you need to set up the why. Like if you can get like, why are we doing this? You can get people bought into that vision.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a really good point when you talk about getting people on board. I'd like to like double click into that a little bit. What are some of
Yeah.
the processes or things you're doing to get people on board to actually get them both internal inside of your organization, but also to your point, I think the harder part of change management is not actually within your org. It's actually all of the cross functional components within it. So, what are some of the things you've done to help drive some of that?
Yeah. So you really hit on something, because I think the steps in leadership and the steps in your ability to kind of go through the organization are a function of, can you drive change in yourself as an individual contributor and be self-aware and move up? Then can you drive change within your own organization? And then can you drive change across organizations? And so I guess an example for us would be, recently we've re-engineered the way we've approached the top of the funnel. And I think a lot of companies are recognizing that having the top of the funnel fully integrated into the breadth of the selling process is really important. I think it's nothing novel or unique that we're doing, but globally, you could make any organization work. So you could have the SDRs or BDRs, depending on which column in your company. You could have them reporting into regional sales leadership. You could have them reporting into global sales leadership, into global marketing. You could do this in a lot of different ways. What's important is that the activities and the metrics of which you're going to assess that talent are kind of being deployed in a consistent way from point to point, and that best practices are easily shared, and that programs that are rolled out once across the globe and not just rolled out once across the region. Yet you're still not allowing yourself to fall victim to that consistency. I think that there's a lost deals buried under the temple of consistency. So you have to let people continue to flex. And at least the way that we approached it in this most recent initiative, is that we took advantage of technology and standards and reporting and dashboards for some of the top of funnel to be that consistency driver. And so if we had expectations that XYZ person in Minneapolis was going to be making X number of calls a day, those same expectations were in place for Singapore, for London, or wherever those resources were sitting. So technology was helpful. Also, I think to be able to see the results that come out of that and be able to kind of bang the table on these results are working is important in part of that. And I, even despite what I said, any org structure, you could make it work. I think some org structures work better than others. And so, at least in our case, we did make some changes to the org structure to make it work. And what I wanted to know, like when we started making those changes, was I didn't care about as much about consistency of the way people went about their jobs. I cared about consistency of outcomes. And we have now gotten to the point where every new, we call them SDRs, that we add, we get X number of dollars of pipeline created per month on a consistent basis. And as long as I am getting that consistent baseline pipeline created, then I know that I can add another one, I can add another one, and I can add another one until it starts to diminish. And building that scalability across the globe for me was really important. So maybe I'm giving a long-winded answer. I'm talking maybe more about my example than I am the question that you asked. But those are some of the things that we did to try to make that global initiative happen.
No, and weirdly enough, I actually really like the example because it's a hot topic. It's one that I've even had
Yeah,
to address a lot recently. You know, one of the questions, and to your point, this is digressing a little bit, but that's fine. I'd love to actually double click on something else here, which is you talked about org structure working better in different ways, and and so you're saying, hey, for our company, we made some changes because we thought it could
yeah,
be aligned better. I'm curious in this because this is a topic that I've been having a lot of discussions on, and actually not just current, but in multiple roles I've been involved with. Do
yeah,
you think that that has to do more with function or people? And what I mean by that is like it's easy even in RevOps. In fact, I released an
yeah,
episode you might have seen today or yesterday about like what should fall under RevOps, and that's always a
yeah.
hot topic as well.
I did see that. Yeah,
And as there's always strong opinions, but I used an example at our last company that you and I worked together at. Marketing ops, for example, was under marketing there. And in
yeah,
general, my general gut says, hey, marketing ops should fall under RevOps. I think that's a best
yeah,
practice. But as I talk about in my episode, like one of the things that I thought was really great was like we had such a great marketing leader and we already had such a great marketing ops leader that
yeah,
it wasn't like to me, I was like, yes, this could fall under here, but it's already working well. Why break what it's fixing? And
yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm curious from your perspective, even on this SDR topic. So I'm going to go into the SDR topic. Do you feel like it's more of, hey, it's probably like the RevOps thing. Do you feel like it's more of like, hey, it should always align this way, or in our case, it worked. It made sense to align it this way because we had the people, process, whatever in place
Yeah.
to really make it be more effective in that way.
I definitely think it's the latter. I think in our case, I think there's probably five different ways to win at, any decision that you might make. So there's um, the former CEO of Hewlett Packard talked about organizations, and he said, I could spend all year reorging, and it would be a giant distraction, and it would be all the water cooler talk. What I really need to do is just make sure people are aligned and focusing on the right tasks. So he had a great bias against reorganizations. And maybe because I heard him say that a few times, I have the same sort of the back of my mind. I'm always reluctant to reorg.
Hmm.
The problem I had, I think if it was a local, if it had all been in North America, I could have probably done it different ways. But I was experiencing with different leaders over different periods of time, sort of different senses of what they wanted these SDRs to do for them.
Hmm.
And on one extreme, it was, the SDR basically there are boilerplates running or putting tabletop tents for them at conferences, which was not the intention of that team from the very beginning. And I think, but even under the best of circumstances, you're not getting them all on the same phone call with the same leader, looking at the same metrics, week after week after, as part of their alignment cadence.
Hmm.
You're continuing to isolate them within the regions, which is good for some things, but it was for us, it wasn't enough to really get them focused on on the level of change and the level of restructuring their day-to-day tasks that we were going through. But I do think it could work anyway. In our case, we moved them, at one point years ago, probably about 9, 10 years ago, they were in marketing. And then they went over to sales. And so you get the benefits of that intra-region alignment, but you get the lack of consistency. In this case, moved them We moved them back into marketing and put them under a central leadership in the demand generation pillar. And it worked for us, but I could easily see arguments on both sides.
I like the way you framed there's 5 different ways to solve every problem. It's something that
Yeah.
I talk a lot about. Like, I had something, there's times in all of our journeys where things that come out of our control happen. It's just part of, especially being in leadership. And
Yeah.
and I find myself I think this year I've especially just been stretched where I get to that point of like, "Oh, I don't know what I'm going to do. This was not planned, and this is on
Yeah.
top of of the million things I already have on my plate." And in those moments, I'll get to a point where I'll take a step back and I'll take a deep breath and I'll go, "Okay, hold on. Like, this is not dire. There's always a way out of this. There's always multiple
Yeah.
ways out of it." And it's
Yeah.
amazing at how that, I don't know, there's something powerful, and I like that you even talk about, for you, you have that kind of the back of your mind always, about reorgs. There's something powerful about having that kind of comfort in any task you come up against. It's this, like, there is probably, in a lot of instances, a better way to do something, but in a lot of instances it's like, what's the least bad option? And in other instances,
Yeah.
it's we could try it, and we don't know which one's going to work, and we're going to A/B test this. And having
Yeah.
your data background, I'm sure you can relate to that side of it.
But I know, Jesse, I had an example when I was very young. It was one of my very first management roles, and at the time, I believed that the way I did it was the right way, and period, end of story. And that was across everything, and that the people on my team were going to do it the way that I would do it. And there was a woman on the team at the time who was arguably much smarter than me, and she worked very hard and had been very successful. But she just always had a different approach than the way that I would go about it, and in forcing her to always think about it my way and do it my way, I don't think I did her or myself any good. And I think it took me a couple of years of growing up and maturity to be able to look back on that and be self-aware enough to say that I was the problem. Because it's not just that her way may have been better, because it doesn't matter if her way was better or my way was better. She didn't feel empowered. She felt overmanaged. Um, she was arguably right with what the way she wanted to go about it would have worked just as well. And I think if you can get from point A to point B in the same distance with the same amount of struggle, and point A allows the individual to make their own decision about it, and point B is you're telling them what to do, then I would take point um, strategy A every time. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's a good call out around, to your point, kind of the growth of leadership. And it's one that I would have to admit I've also struggled with, as somebody who likes to be right and likes to come up with the
Yeah.
ideas and solve the problems.
We all do. I mean, yeah.
Right? Yeah, but
Yeah.
but it's a good call out, because I think, success these days looks very different. I was talking to a friend of mine recently about this, and how up until a certain point it was, what problem could I solve? Like, that was really kind of the metric for
Yeah.
me, at least in my career. Or how could I lead within something? Now it is more about, how do you make the people around you successful, and really,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, their success ultimately is your success. And it's a different lens. And then also just genuinely getting to the point of, like, you want to bring the best out of people. And how do you do that? To your
Yeah.
point, it's the I remember my dad, it was early on, I'm digressing a little bit here, but when I was 9, one of the things my dad used to do is he would sit me down, and he was a CEO of a financial planning firm, and he would tell me a client scenario. So he would walk me through, hey, this upset client came today, here was their problem, and he
Yeah.
wouldn't tell me how he solved it. He would actually say, hey, like, what would you do? And I'm 9 years old. He'd be like, what would you
Yeah.
do in this? And I don't know why, but that always, like, stuck with me, of this,
Yeah.
you know, framing it. Or even though he knew the answer, he even knew it wasn't like I was going to come up with 9 years old with a really good answer, but it was to start getting me to think through
Yeah.
it, and eventually, get to that point. So I don't know. It's something that always has kind of stuck with me.
Yeah. I don't. Yeah, and there were probably times where he really didn't know, and you gave him the answer, and the next day you had solved the problem for him. Sometimes it's not just about developing people; it's about recognizing that others have good ideas as well. Yeah.
No, and you're right. And
No
even
matter
if
how experienced they are. Yeah.
Well, and even if maybe that the response that individual is giving you isn't necessarily the right answer, it can trigger like a different perspective, right? Because ultimately
Yeah,
perspectives are what a lot of this is. So
it's true. It's very true.
so shifting on the leadership, actually, like you've built now a fair amount of teams and cultures and continue to grow them up. Talk a little bit about like what are some of the key types, when you're hiring a growth org, a sales org, like, what are some of the key roles you look for, and not just the key roles themselves, but like the attributes within the people that you're hiring for? So I think that's kind of two sides to the question.
Yeah. So there are certain qualities that I look for in people, and there's certain tricks I do. In tricks is maybe the wrong word. There's certain ways that I look for people to answer questions in interviews. I I think like everybody, you want people to come in with a certain level of professional curiosity about how they improve the organization in which they sit. A certain sense of how do I do something better, not just kind of do the job that I'm supposed to have. So you want to look for some chops for people who can problem solve and get that done. We're um, we're also at a point where we're about to go over the 1,000 employee mark, and culturally we've struggled to we're at a point where we're not going to be able to bond on culture through shared experiences anymore. We go to our kickoffs and there's 20% of the people in the room are brand new. So there were days when we could all bond over, oh, remember when we got that done, or remember how hard that was, or even remember that great time we had at the bar at that kickoff, whatever it was. And I think those days are sort of behind us. So we need to be much more prescriptive around how do we bond around shared values, and we need to call out those values, and those values can be very basic, like we respect each other and treat each other with respect, or they can be very specific. In our case, we have a value around assuring that the clients get the business outcomes that they expect from us. And you really talk about this, you share stories of it, and people begin to sort of wrap their head around what that means and how it's maybe different from other companies where they've worked. And it does become part of the DNA. And you can easily scale that, whereas you couldn't scale the time together in the trenches building the business. And so that's one of the observations that I've had to make as we've gotten to the size that we've gotten. We need to pick our values and be deliberate about them. But as you asked me what we look for with the people that we hire, and I feel like I'm not doing what I'm about to say right now as I speak. But I look for people that just get to the point.
Hmm.
So I always ask a very specific question in an interview, much less interested in what the answer is, but more interested in the fact that I get a very specific answer. So if I ask a simple question, just tell me the answer. Don't, step back and tell me the history of your experience with this, particular issue, or don't give me like five different ways of looking at the problem. If I ask you, I'm trying to think of a good
Yeah, you
example.
got an example.
Have you
That'd be
ever had
great.
experience with have you ever been in a situation where this happened and it made you feel uncomfortable? You can certainly explain it, but start by saying yes. Start by saying no, that's really not something that I've had experience with. And I'm just shocked at how few people give specific answers in interviews. It's almost it's so rare that I know that when I find it in an individual that I can it helps me build enthusiasm for their candidacy.
And talk to me, like, I'm gonna dig into this a little bit because I've never thought about this or heard it, but it's an interesting one. Tell me, like, what is your in your mind when you hear somebody answer you directly? Like, what does that do for you? Like, why is it such a big deal for you?
Because I think you sit in meetings and you have a lot of work to do every day. You have a lot of decisions to make every day. And people sit in meetings and they make a lot of contributions to the conversation that really don't lead you to the decision you're trying to make. Everybody knows why you sat down here in the meeting. The objective of this meeting was to make a decision on this or to get this outcome. And many people's brains are wired in such a way as they just want to something triggers and they pontificate on it for some time and they go off course. I think people that can give you specific answers and just get right to the point are generally people who are focused, and people who are focused are people who get work done. That's what I think.
I mean, again, I've never thought about it, but I like it. I like the idea.
I didn't
Is
make
it?
it up. Somebody told, oh, some woman I worked with told me this a long time ago, and I said, "That's great."
No, you're right. There's something to it, and I think, yeah, a lot of it. There's some truth to it because I do think the ability to suss that out in an interview who can actually get things done, that is not the easiest one, and I like
Yeah.
the
I mean,
perspective.
if you ask you 10 questions in an interview, you'd get 10 specific answers. And that is like your thing. I mean, you are very directed and pointed, and there's nothing gets in the way between sort of what you're, whatever, if it's a question or something you're trying to accomplish and where you're going with it. Focus is one of your great strengths.
Well, I appreciate
Yeah,
that.
you know,
Probably to an OCD degree sometimes.
maybe so.
When you think about, you talked about attributes you're looking for when hiring. You've talked about company culture and how you are really focusing on
Yeah,
fostering that, going forward. But what would you say, like when you're like, I'm gonna paint a picture here. You're sitting in a sales meeting and a leadership meeting with your go to
yeah,
market org. So you're sitting in a leadership meeting with your trusted inner circle. So you're sitting in the
yeah.
inner circle. What are some of those principles that you're, instilling, or you're trying to help foster good conversation, which hopefully then obviously at this point trickles into the rest of your go to market org? What would you say some of those conversations look like around, again, driving really good culture and values that align to what you're looking to?
Well, I feel like I'm gonna give you some motherhood and apple pie answers here, but I always prefer that people lean into empowering their teams rather than just kind of telling them what to do. So that's one of the things I like culturally. I think respect is motherhood and apple pie. We need to have that for each other. Um, I think also one of the ones that's a little harder is particularly in sales organizations, we give people objectives and we ask them to hit those objectives. And then sometimes, not all the time, but often enough, particularly as you go up the ladder, sometimes those objectives get in the way of other good things for the company. So there's going to be trade-offs. If you do that, then we're not going to be able to do this over here because we have finite resources. And yes, it seems like the right thing to do in and of itself when you look at it isolated. So if you had, we do sometimes custom integrations to new property management systems, for example. We don't have 25,000 people sitting out there waiting in a bench for the next one to come along. And if somebody brings to us a really great opportunity but it's maybe somewhat modest, then we know we're going to take our resources off the bench when another opportunity might be waiting in the wings. And I think those are the challenges where we put individuals' goals in conflict with maybe the organization's broader goals. That's an easy example to explain, but you see this kind of thing happen all the time.
So
And
so on the empowerment side, like what would you say, again, that's to your point, that's motherhood apple pie, but like when you break that down, I mean, I think it's easy to say we want to empower our people, right?
yeah,
It's like every company will have their core cultural values. Very few, as you and I both know, fully live into those. What would you say you're doing to really, again, kind of foster that sense of empowerment and helping even your leaders, I don't want to say drive the point home, but create an environment that really, encourages that.
well, there's one individual with whom I used to work who led a regional sales team, and he would kind of take me through what he was thinking, and I would say, yeah, I might do it slightly different, but I would rather you do it the way that you came up with. It's more important to me that you feel empowered than you make this little tweak on the edges to make me happy. And sometimes you might say that out loud, but more often than not, you just keep your mouth shut and say, "I like it, go." Um, Biting your tongue sometimes. Every opportunity to mentor somebody in air quotes is not does not have to be executed upon. Sometimes sometimes you're leading by example by just saying, "That's fantastic, go with it." particularly given what we talked about before, where there's usually at least three or four different, five different ways to get to the same outcome. So I'm really big on that. I think it also, I think you know, how you spend your interactions with those individuals is an important part of empowerment. If you ask them to take you through every single deal in their funnel and every single rep on a weekly cadence and go through in micro detail of what's happening and give feedback on every element of it, that's not a culture of empowerment. It's stepping back and not asking all the detailed questions. There's there's so many I mean, we do deals across the globe, so it's actually probably impossible for me to know at any point in time what what's happening with every deal. But I also have no desire to know at any point in time what's happening with every deal. And somebody told me one time, this is going to be a horrible metaphor, but somebody told me one time that owning a restaurant is like having a party at your house, except you're not there. Other people are having the party at your house, and they're all meth addicts. So I sometimes feel like, and this is a horrible metaphor, but sometimes I feel like a sales organization is the same thing. Somebody's out there right now, in my case, globally, 24 hours a day because of time zones, talking to clients about something, and I have no idea what they're saying.
Hmm.
You really have to trust that these salespeople, who certainly aren't meth addicts, but they have a different sort of culture than other functions within an organization. You ultimately have to trust that people up and down the organization org chart have made the right decisions about populating them, about making sure they're showing up at meetings with the right circle of support around them, and you just have to believe that the system that you can put in place works better than your own judgment. And I certainly believe that.
Well, and you know, you if you don't actually execute that, then it ultimately, I mean, your ability to scale becomes almost impossible. A and
Yeah,
B, you're also not really trusting what you put into place, right? Or what you've
that's true.
empowered,
Yeah,
within it, right? I think that's a big part of it. It,
that's true.
it's funny because you said this keeping your mouth shut, and I'm like thinking back on my week this week, and I'm not gonna lie, like I struggle in this area because I see, and it kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's like I see, and I think part of it also has to do with levels of risk, right? Like
Yeah,
you're
that's
gonna
true
keep
too.
you're gonna keep your mouth shut on the things ideally that are lower risk, and you're
Yeah,
probably gonna step in. If it's a board facing thing, then it's a little different. But
for sure, for sure, for
right,
sure. That's
but I still think it's a good call out because it's something I'll be honest I struggle with is just the if I see a better way, I get so focused on, exceptional and you're right. Sometimes it's even if it's you said there are five different ways to do it, and maybe it's not the best, but it still gets the job done, and it's incrementally
yeah,
not a big deal. And again, the risk on it is low. Whether it's not a board level facing thing or whatever the thing is that we're dealing with. But I like the call out because I think you're right, especially when you're actually talking about breathing into empowerment. Um, yeah, it's I don't know. It was a good reminder for me. I think within that as well. And then I think the other comment you made was really getting into. I also think styles of reps. So this is interesting,
yeah,
and I'm sure you've thought through this as well. But enough in both of our careers, I'm sure, but especially in yours, like there are reps that are successful that you know are very like if you look at your top reps, I've got some that are very relationship heavy. They're kind of I would say
yeah,
your quintessential sales rep. But then
yeah,
even myself when I was a rep for a number of years, like I was very process data driven
yeah.
person, and
I
I
can see that
found
you wouldn't have been the relationship guy,
no, I was
slapping
like,
backs kind of
I
drinks.
could do it, and ultimately
Yeah,
I'd build good relationships in the long term. But the way I did it more was process, I would say. And
yeah,
I think, it's easy, I think, a lot of times in sales to go, well, this rep doesn't look this way, and
yeah.
therefore they're not a good fit. And I actually think, don't get me wrong, there are certain profiles obviously that we're like, oh,
Sure.
that's
Yeah,
not going to be
yeah,
a good fit. But I think
yeah,
in general, the more I've seen, and probably the more you've seen, right? You see a variation of different types of reps that you would go, man, I would never do it this way, and I don't think I
Yeah.
could do it this way, but it's working for them somehow. And so how do we empower them even more, going forward?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. We have some amazing reps that I could not imagine having an organization full of them. And for my part, I would rather hire the process rep. I can't scale the relationship rep.
Right.
I don't trust that the relationship rep works every time.
Mhm.
I don't want to say I, I sort of controversially say relationships are overrated. It's not that they're not important, but you need to have what's behind the relationship in place, process, resources, whatever is important to move forward with. And it needs to be articulated and communicated, and terms need to be structured in the right way. And usually that comes from people who are following a process, is my experience. I had a young woman who we only recently hired, and in the last 6 months, this woman has done 7 new logo deals. And in our business, that's very unusual that you would do that many. And I think that even someone who's successful, we would only expect him in the first 6 months, particularly if they didn't know kind of a lot about our software, which she doesn't. You'd only expect him to do one deal in their first 6 months. And so I had to know what is this individual doing? And I got on the phone with this person, and it was clear to me that she had a number of characteristics that we've talked a little bit about. You and I both talked about in the last half hour. One, she's very curious and very self-aware. So she's curious about the process. Like as she's in the meeting, is this going well? Am I doing well? Am I questioning whether or not the meeting is going well, that maybe we had too many setup slides before we got to the demo, looking at the body language of people in the room, stopping the meeting and saying, are you ready for the demo? It looks like maybe you're getting exhausted. Um, and then someone who's very comfortable feeling that they're at an equal social status with even the more senior clients in the room who might be more experienced in their roles and older. And she says had no issues with that whatsoever, because she saw the value that she could bring them by bringing this solution to the table, and had no problem aligning on expectations for timing and aligning on expectations for next steps for that reason. Um, Also, there's some things that are sort of as people who grew up selling when I did, never give a price early in the cycle, never do a demo early in the cycle. She's like, I'm doing my demos early in the cycle. I'm telling them the price earlier in the cycle. And I think we've all sort of questioned, well, maybe we should be telling, because when you sit down and buy software, you want to see the demo early. You want to know what the price is soon, because you may or may not be able to afford this. And I hate when I get played and slow rolled as a buyer of software. So we had been doing that generally in our sales process anyway, and but she was all over it and even accelerating it beyond what we had done. But she was so thoughtful and so capable of assessing what was working and wasn't working for her. And I think that the ability to rise above ourselves and look down on what we're doing and fix our own weaknesses and fix elements of the process and the resources around us. I mean, these are the traits that really set the best apart, without any question.
Well, it's interesting. So I buy a ton of software, a lot of
Yeah.
software. And and it's amazing to me, if I look back on all the software I purchased over the last year, which is millions,
Yeah.
it's kind of crazy when you think of, I guess, between renewals and all that, it'd be millions. But there's only like two or three reps that in my mind right now come to mind. I'm like, man, that was a phenomenal sales experience.
Yeah.
That's it, two or three. And if you had to boil it down, and again, I'm a sample size of one, so what's important to me is not important to every buyer. But you
Yeah.
know, at the end of the day, if you boil it down, there was a couple of key traits that I think were really phenomenal. And actually, you hit the nail on the head. Like, I don't like, I'm so direct anyways. So the idea that you're
Yeah.
going to drag out a sales process for me, you're going
And
to,
you're impatient, and I'm impatient also.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
like, I don't have time. Like at the end of the day, I
Yeah.
don't have time. It's like, there was a big vendor that I really love their software recently. And I got on a call with them, and I bought their software before, and I just said, "Hey guys, look, I just need to know rough cost. Like, I need to understand if this is even
Yeah.
feasible as we think about budget planning this next year." And they were like, well, we have to do this first and this first. And I said, look, here's the deal. If you can't give this to me, I understand your process, but like I'm out. Uh, and
Yeah.
it, and I hate to say that, but at the end of the day, so I think it's interesting you point out her attributes because if I think about it, like there's a guy who won a big deal last year with me, and his product was probably second best, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
But his sales process was like night and day between the other one. And so there was something
Yeah.
for me where like the product was good enough where it wasn't like I like settled, ridiculously, but
Yeah.
he consistently scheduled meetings. He was very clear up front. He was respectful of my time.
Yeah.
If a meeting was scheduled 30 minutes, he didn't take 30 minutes, or he didn't even wait till the end
Yeah.
of the 30 minutes to ask me for my next meeting. He's stopping at 24 minutes and going, "Hey, we either ran out of time today or I want to make sure we get it scheduled." And he understood the pain of like being the buyer, right? Of like,
Yeah. Yeah.
"Hey, I don't have a lot of time." And he would summarize my meetings afterwards, so I didn't have to like take my own. I still took notes, but I didn't have to get too
Yeah.
detailed on it. And there was always kind of that clear next step. And I don't know, it's an interesting thing because you're right. Some of that is not your like sales one. It's not the training I got either. But for me, especially, it makes a huge difference.
It's really putting your shoes in the feet in the shoes of the people who are making the decisions. And clearly it depends. I mean, this woman is it works in on closer to the transactional side of our business where they're smaller organizations. You can't do that with a large global brand.
Right.
I mean, they welcome the discovery and they welcome the alignment around their strategic objectives, but not everybody does. And I think we see, you got to get to the C level and align around their strategic objectives, et cetera, which in some cases is true, but in some cases makes it a heavy transaction and buying process. So, you know, that self-awareness is really what it is. What's the right path forward.
Yep.
Yep.
Exactly. So I wanna shift gears here, and we're gonna kind of go on the last topic. But this has been really good. I want to talk about board and executive level leadership. I think this is a topic you've got a ton of experience in. I've started really building a lot of experience myself here, but still learning. But I think a lot of people that are newer to sales leadership or go to market leadership, they're just starting to get familiar with this. And we know, you and I have had to work together with boards before,
Yeah.
but we know the delicate balance of, managing really CEOs and executives and also managing boards. You know, what would some advice that you would pass on to somebody maybe new to this around that stakeholder management in navigating, the challenge that is this thing? And it's not to say like, you want to be not transparent, but the reality is they're different audiences. You've got different objectives, different perspectives. What would some advice be that you'd pass on around that?
Yeah, and you and I kind of gone back and forth a little on this, and the situation where when you and I were together, I mean, the board in that case, we were very aligned on what outcomes senior operational leadership and the board was very aligned on the outcomes that we expected, and they were very bright people who had a lot of good ideas. There was never any. There may have been you might have tread carefully on some subjects more than other subjects, but there was never a lack of transparency or obfuscation. And I think if you have any of that going on, it's poison. And I would say the operational leadership is probably not going to be in place long. If any of that continues, and it's silly to say this, but if you don't have that alignment and you don't have that sense of mutual trust, then either the players need to change or you're not going to advance. And perhaps when things are going very, very well, some of that stuff doesn't show up. But as soon as things aren't going very, very well, the light of day is going to shine pretty bright on those challenges. Um, I'm also fortunate that I've never been involved with a board where I don't think that they were really bright and that their guidance wasn't really helpful. I've also never been in a board situation where uh, they're they were heavy-handed with their direction. It's always been not only spoken as recommendations and guidance, but it's actually been recommendations and guidance. And there's always been a very healthy back and forth on what other options or other alternatives might be. So I've never been in a situation where I felt at odds with a board. in my experience. So maybe that's just my good fortune, or maybe that's fairly common and is typical. I don't know what your experience has been.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is exactly, where I would say I lean towards. I've had mixed experience. I think you and I had a pretty good experience with the board
Yeah,
and in general with the executive leadership. But I've seen other situations that I would say are more toxic. And I think, to your point,
yeah,
those typically only lead one way, right? Like at the end of the
yeah,
day, and I've been in some situations where I've had some executive leaders try to sweep things under the rugs, and uh, you know, you can do that for a quarter or two, but eventually that
yeah,
bites you, right? And so, I was talking to an executive leader recently, and there was some data we were looking at. I'm always geeking out over stuff, and it wasn't a positive data point. And we were talking like, it wasn't like we were trying to hide it, but
yeah,
should we put this in there, and how should we put this in there? And the advice I gave actually was, I was like, hey, just say that you're like, you uncovered this, and here's what you're doing about it. Like, you
yeah,
learned this piece of information. It's
yeah,
not ideal. It wasn't great quarter within this area, but here's what we learned, and here's what we're going to try. And I think that if you don't have an environment where you can do that in, and that, obviously we're all held accountable to results, and but
yeah,
at the end of
yeah,
the day, we're also all human. And I
yeah,
think, especially in the environments we work in, we, to a degree, we have to take risks. We have to try things, and they don't always work. You might try a new
yeah,
product strategy or new pricing strategy or whatever
yeah,
that might be. And I think at the end of the day, as long as it's like the fell fast, fell forward, and I think so.
yeah,
I say that delicately because I think it's cool that you've been able to lean into that, and I think not everybody. I think newer people in this environment wonder, how transparent should they be, and I do think the environments that I prefer to work in, are ones where the board and the executive team is fostering this willingness of having an open dialogue. And we're like,
yeah.
actually, you said this to me. I remember when you first hired me, I asked you, and actually before I was hired, I said, tell me about the board, and you said they attack problems, not people.
It's very
Uh,
true
and I
of our
think that
experience.
that to me is like, if you had to boil it down to it, like, that is kind of what everybody should be looking for in that
Yeah,
thing, where it's like, how do we solve these problems that we're dealing with? And you've got ideally people to lean on. To your point, you're not dealing with you're dealing with smart people, and so you've got other
yeah.
people that maybe have seen multiple companies that can also provide advice around those lines.
Yeah, for sure. And I think if I had this is exactly the advice I would give to any really smart, accomplished operational leader, whether it be in sales or any function that had to deal with a board for the first time. I would say be 100% transparent and never be defensive. You only look stupid because they really don't care about you. They care about the business and the challenges and they could care less about whether you feel good about the outcome of this, or if you feel a little guilty for it having occurred under your watch. They could care less. They just want to, at least in my experience, they want to solve problems. And if you are defensive, you look weak and you look stupid. And neither one of those are a good look. So
No, it's
yeah,
a good call out, and I think it. Let's call it as, all of us have our moments, but it is
yeah,
being mindful during those times of, again, they're not, to your point, they're not attacking me. They're really trying to get to the heart of what's wrong here, and they
yeah.
want to then lend advice, or lend help however they can to provide, again, to course correct ultimately.
Yeah. One of the essential truths of running a sales organization, particularly as it gets larger and you kind of go up and you have multiple layers, is at any point in time, somebody could come into your garden and pick up a rock and there's going to be a bug under it. There's no chance that you're executing everything perfectly in every element of your business with every single individual contributor, sales leader, et cetera. It's a matter of being comfortable that those bugs are there, minimizing them, working to be as effective and efficient as you can. you know when you do see a problem, have a hypothesis, test the hypothesis with data, put a plan of action in place, and then test the impact of it. Just go through that motion. And that's what I think that's what successful organizations do. And I think that's how organizations that aren't successful and fix themselves, that's what they do as well. Yeah,
No, it's exactly the more you kick the can, the more you try to sweep under, that's kicking the can of the inevitable, right? Versus actually trying to solve the problem. That's your only
Yeah,
only way out. So,
I agree.
well, hey, really have enjoyed the conversation. Really appreciate you sharing the insights and taking some time out. Hit like, subscribe to continue to follow along as we get to impact change across our organizations in the industry. To the journey.